So one day, a farmer was walking toward his barn when he looked down the driveway and saw a pickup truck pull up and park. A man got out of the truck and walked over to the farmer. So he took a notepad and pencil out of his pocket and wrote, "I am deaf. How can I help you?" He gave the note to the man, who basically glazed over the note, shrugged his shoulders, and gave the note back. So the farmer gestured for him to wait, and he went into his house and came out with his 4-year-old daughter. When the little girl came out and said hi, the man said, "Oh, I was looking for the sheep farm, but I must have stopped at the wrong place." The little girl signed to the farmer and then said, "My dad says that that farm is 1.5 miles further down the road on the right side." The man just kind of scratched his head, walked over to his vehicle, and said under his breath, "How can that be? How can a deaf man be a farmer?" A few years later, that same farmer took his wife and 3 daughters to a local cafe where they were enjoying a meal and conversation around the table, just like every other family was in the restaurant. However, the farmer's family was using sign language. A man and woman who had just finished eating and were getting ready to leave the restaurant stopped by their table. The woman looked at one of the daughters and said, "Are these your parents?" And the little girl said, "Yes, this is my mom and dad." And she went, "I am so sorry." Why are these stories important? They illustrate a common reaction by society when they interact with people who are different from them. And that's why it's important for us to talk about difference. Because if difference is not welcome, it suggests that diversity and inclusion are not welcome. The farmer in this story is my dad. Both my mother and father are deaf. And I was the little girl that interpreted between the man looking for the sheep farm and my dad. I was also the proud daughter in that restaurant who was promptly told by a stranger how sorry she was I had deaf parents. So before we broach the topic of the deaf community and difference, we need to talk about what it means to be normal and how we categorize and treat people that don't fit that definition of normal. Surprisingly, since the 1800s, America has embraced the eugenics movement. We were all consumed with creating the greatest race, and in doing so, we identified certain desirable characteristics like height range and color of the skin, even size of the nose were important factors in that process. So if you had a physical or sensory issue, you were not going to fit that definition of normal, and you were automatically marginalized into this other and separate category. Over the last 150 years, we have been conditioned to feel empathy and pity for people that don't fit the definition of normal, and to develop strategies on how to solve their problems so that they could fit back into society. Well, wanting people to be the same as us or normal is contrary to the value we find in diversity. So in essence, normal is the opposite of diversity. Today, I'd like to introduce to you 3 models or perspectives within which to see the deaf community: the medical model, the social model, and the cultural model. These 3 perspectives will fundamentally define how you see, treat, and place deaf people within our society. You might even recognize your own perspective, and by the time we're done today, you might consider adopting a new one. So let's start with the medical model. Anytime we encounter something that is new or unfamiliar to us, we come at it from our own personal frame of reference. So when you think about a deaf person, you might think, "Oh, they'll never be able to enjoy music, or they'll never be able to hear their baby's first words, or boy, it must be lonely and very isolating to be deaf. Well, society imposes the label of disability on the deaf community, but that label is not congruent with the way deaf people see and experience their deaf life. So let's start with the medical model. The medical model focuses on the body part or condition that's abnormal. And in this case, we're talking about the ears, the hearing, which needs to be fixed. From there, they're thrust into wearing hearing devices, or enduring medical procedures, or practicing therapies that falsely aim at reversing their deafness and making them normal to fit into society, rather than using these tools as helpful and useful ways to live their deaf experience. Take the term hearing impaired. We all think that that is the politically correct way to refer to deaf people, when in fact it's offensive and even derogatory. I mean, think about the term. Hearing, so you're focusing on the body part and condition, impaired. You're outright telling that person they're broken. We can just call them deaf people. And the medical model imposes the responsibility on the individual to take care of their problem so that they can fit into society. Rarely does anybody talk about the barriers that exist and how a lot of those barriers are caused by society, let alone how to accommodate for them. I mean, that would explain why that hospital allowed me, a child of 4, 5, and even 6, to interpret for my parents every time my mom had a miscarriage. You would think after the first time, or definitely the second time, that they would have brought in an adult fluent in sign language to do the communicating among the adults. But they never did. But on the flip side of that, there were always times where it was very beneficial for me to be my parents' interpreters. Like at parent-teacher conferences, when the teacher would say, Diana doesn't finish her work on time because she talks a lot in class. And I said, Diana's doing very well in class and has a lot of friends. The second model, the social model, shifts the focus from the individual's body part or condition to society taking a role, a responsibility in making sure that society doesn't make it worse. From the social perspective, we're more apt to do the right thing from the very start. This perspective leads to laws being passed, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, where businesses and organizations are prohibited from discriminating against or from excluding deaf people from their products, their services, their programs. Under this model, you will find organizations providing interpreting services and other accommodations to make sure that no one is left out. My mom used to tell me stories of when she was growing up, and she was discouraged from using sign language in certain public places. Well, today, 48 out of 50 states recognize American Sign Language for high school and college credit. So today, we have the medical model, which is prevalent, and deaf people grapple with that every single day. We also have the social model, which provides for access, but it only does so because it's legislated. And it's difficult to change attitudes and perspectives through laws. So let's take these two models, set them aside, because there is another model, another perspective with which to view the deaf community. It's much more inclusive as well. So, a culture, any culture, is defined by having a language, shared norms and traditions, and a community of people. And this is the model within which to see the deaf community. Now, it's obvious to recognize deaf people when they start signing. We use sign language in our home every day. It was my first language. In fact, it was my native language. And people tend to think sign language is universal, when in fact, ASL is one of 140 sign languages around the world, just like there are multitudes of spoken languages around the world. Sign language, a lot of people think, is a sign for English words in English word order. Well, American Sign Language has a very complex and unique grammar and syntax based on visual language. So things like hand shape, intensity of sign, use of space, facial expressions are all part of the linguistic features of American Sign Language. Let's take the sentence, "I picked these delicious apples out of that tree." In order to sign using a visual language, you can't pick anything out of the tree until you set up the tree. So you would say it like this: tree, apple, and then you'd point to it and look to it and raise your eyebrows because that indicates that this is the subject. Then you would use a classifier. This would be me walking to the tree. Then I change the classifier and show myself climbing up the tree. When I get to the top, I start picking the apples and putting them into an imaginary basket. Then I take a bite and I say, "Delicious." And my facial expression has to match my intent. Now, that is an example of a very simple sign language sentence. And if you noticed, it's very different from a linear English sentence structure. Deaf norms mean that many deaf people marry other deaf people, and they hope for deaf children. My mother took a spoon to a pan and clanged it, and she was so sad when we jumped because we failed her deaf test. Just like all other parents who want their children to be just like them, my parents wanted us kids to be deaf just like them. And storytelling is a cherished tradition within the deaf community. They share stories about their successes and their setbacks, their humor, their folklore. They even celebrate their heritage through storytelling and pass it along through all the generations. And the deaf community have local, all the way to international clubs and associations and conferences covering every aspect of life, from politics to sports to social activities. And the deaf community has made huge contributions to our general society. We just don't know it. Like, take, for example, the football huddle, first used by a deaf football team as they were trying to block the opposing team from seeing what their signs were going to be, telling them what the next play was going to be. And Girl Scouts of America was founded by Juliette Gordon Low, a deaf woman. And Alexander Graham Bell accidentally invented the telephone while he was trying to create a communication device for his deaf mother. Yeah, he had one too. And his deaf wife. Now, where would we be today without the invention of the telephone? And Pepsi Cola embraced the deaf community and the deaf experience through their 30-second Super Bowl commercial shown in front of the largest audience out there, showcasing the world's oldest deaf joke. The cultural model recognizes that, yes, deaf people can't hear, but they have a language, they have a culture, and they have a people. They need to have a place at every table. Why would anyone have the medical model perspective, which works to eliminate deafness, when the people inside of that community celebrate and embrace their deafness? Now, the social model does provide for equal access, but it still misses the mark. The deaf community, with its language and its stories and its community, is alive and well. And if we can all embrace that community, we don't create this separate or other category. We actually all share in the very same space, and that is what inclusion really looks like. So I challenge you today to take a different perspective, an inclusive perspective, the cultural perspective I saw my parents through growing up in a deaf family. Thank you.